Right.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to another Flyleaf event. Whether you're here for the first time or you've been here before, we really welcome you to the space. And yeah, it's great to have people come to these events and support our store and support our authors. It allows us to keep having these events. Appreciate it. All right. This evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from Leslie Absher about her book, Spy Daughter, Queer Girl. Leslie Absher is a journalist and essayist with work appearing in the Los Angeles Times, Independent, Salon, Huffington Post, Greek Reporter, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Her father joined the CIA before she was born. When she was a baby, her family moved to Athens, Greece, just in time for a coup. Her memoir, Spy Daughter, Queer Girl, is about growing up with a spy and the cost of keeping secrets. She lives in Oakland with her comic book writer/lawyer wife. We also are joined in conversation with Allie Mendelson. Thank you, Allie, for being here.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Hope you enjoy the event. And if you haven't gotten a copy of the book already, you can grab one up at the counter. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm just going to add a couple of things to that bio, which was perfect in every other way, which is that Spy Daughter Queer Girl is a finalist for the Judy Grand Lesbian Nonfiction Award 2023, which is pretty awesome and amazing. And the part that is impressive and also to me a little intimidating, she was also published in the New York Times. So just going to toss that out.
Just by the way.
By the way. And I met Leslie when her family was in Northern Virginia because we went to the same high school. My first impression of Leslie was as someone who just sort of oozed cool. She had a messenger bag, but we all had backpacks. She had painter pants. I had not the right clothes, but everybody else had the preppy clothes, and so
I was a public school kid. Suddenly thrusted into a private school.
Thrust into.
And totally insecure, but I guess I carried the cool anyway.
You did. You totally carried the cool.
Yeah.
And so that's where our paths first crossed. But it's been a lot of fun to reconnect more recently at reunions years ago and again around this amazing book.
And thank you so much, Allie, for bringing me to Chapel Hill, to North Carolina. I'm really excited to be here, and you facilitated it and planted that seed months and months ago, and I said, hey, why not? I've never been to North Carolina. I want to go. So it's just another way this book has been an opportunity for me to sort of open into wider circles, sharing my story, but just also opening my life. So I appreciate it.
And seeing cool bookstores.
Yes, amazing independent bookstores that are still thriving. Woo!
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I came up with some questions, which I didn't share with Leslie because I thought it'd be more fun if she had to think on her feet.
That's fine with me.
Yeah, exactly. But I wrote them down in case I was nervous, but kept them,
Let me interrupt you
Yes.
already.
Oh, great. I can see how this is going to go.
I'm just wondering if I should start by reading a little bit.
Yes, you should absolutely do a reading.
I'm just going to read the prologue because it just sort of sets the tone of the story and kind of it kind of grounds me and kind of drops me into it, and then I can sort of move into the questions from that space. So I'm going to do that. Okay. College Station, Texas, 2002. I didn't know what the visit would be like. We hadn't seen each other since I moved to California 4 years earlier. At 67, Dad was still going strong, teaching and consulting, but I wondered if we would ever feel close. We knew so little about each other. Could this visit change any of that? Should I even go? As the day of my flight approached, it became too late to back out. I flew to Texas, rented a car, and drove to the restaurant where we had agreed to meet. The heat hit me like an oven blast as I climbed out of the car. You can do this, I said to myself. It was midday and quiet when I stepped inside. A handful of customers sat at tables beside a bank of windows. I saw my father up ahead. As he talked with the hostess, She kept her eyes focused on him, nodding and grabbing menus without breaking eye contact. "Hi, Dad," I said, coming up from behind. He turned and smiled. The bulky fabric of his navy blue suit jacket bunched under my arms as I reached up for a hug. He looked the same as last time. Tall, medium build, hair completely white. We followed the hostess toward the back, passing tables cleared from lunch but not yet reset, and arrived at a booth. I slid in and opened the oversized menu, but couldn't concentrate. "You hungry?" he asked. "A little." The waitress brought water and a basket of tortilla chips, and we ordered enchiladas. Dad turned to the TV over the bar, where a football game played with the sound turned down. I had the feeling that the visit was already slipping away. I shouldn't have come, I thought. This was how all of our visits ended up. I started to shrink into myself. "Is there anything you want to know?" Dad said, jolting me from my retreat. I grabbed the straw from my water glass, pulled it into my lap, and started twisting it between my hands. "Have you ever killed anyone?" If Dad was taken aback by my bluntness, he didn't show it. But then he never did. He tended to stay cool while I sweated it out. "I've made decisions that resulted in the loss of life," he said. Behind the thick lensed glasses, his small, light blue eyes slipped into shadow. I tried to work out what he meant by this. Had he ordered people killed? Passed along information that resulted in someone being assassinated? At 37, I only knew the bare minimum about his missions. That he started out working on the Cuban Missile Crisis, got transferred to Greece, and after that, Vietnam. Vietnam. Maybe that's where he made decisions that resulted in the loss of life, as he put it. Or did that happen in Greece? I reminded myself that this is what happened in wars, both overt and covert. People got killed. Still, I was shocked. He wasn't some nameless, faceless spy. He was Dad, my dad. His answer sounded evasive and cagey, and I wanted something real. But bringing up what I especially wanted to know, if he had helped set up the 1967 Greek coup, felt dangerous. Riskier even than asking if he'd ever killed anyone. We didn't have a great track record for talking about anything personal, not about his secrets, or mine, or our families. "What about Greece?" I asked. Dad's hand stopped on its way back from the tortilla basket, a couple of chips clutched between his fingers. What about it? What was the CIA doing there? We were fighting the communists. But didn't we help the Greek military pull off a coup, which led to a dictatorship? We had no idea about that. We were focused on other things, he said. He was making it sound like the Greek military and the CIA never crossed paths, as if the colonels, as the dictators came to be called, had arrested and tortured people in some other Greece, not the Greece where we had lived and where he had worked. "I've heard horrible stories," I said, recalling what friends had told me, instances of guns shoved into faces, people dragged from their houses and beaten inside dark cells. My voice wobbled. I pushed the sharp edge of the creased straw deeper into my palm, wishing I had some kind of proof, or at least more information. "Were your friends on the ground?" Dad popped the chips into his mouth, brushed his fingers together to dust off the salt, and reached for his water glass. I watched a single ice cube slide into his mouth. I had no idea what he meant by on the ground. Was he talking about troops? Soldiers on a battlefield? The people who told me stories of torture were friends I had met in my 20s after college. Not soldiers, just citizens. "Yes," I said. "Well, so was I, and there was none of that." Dad lowered his water glass, subject closed, conversation over. This was what always happened. I sounded lame, and he sounded right. When the food arrived, Dad hunched over his plate to eat. Every now and then, he looked over at the television, which was now a shiny black surface. I had other questions, but what was the point? It was 2002, and even though Dad had been retired for over 10 years, it didn't matter. He'd never tell me the truth. Besides, if I kept pushing for answers, I might lose the tiny, anemic shard of a relationship we had. Barely had. And for what? What did I think this would help me understand anyway? I finished my cheesy enchiladas and watched Dad pay the check in silence. I didn't know it then, but my research and my search for answers about my father and our secret CIA life was just beginning. One day, I thought I might write about his role, the CIA's role in the Greek coup, a journalist's investigation into history, full of dates and facts. At least, that's what I thought it would be about. An expose of his guilt, his culpability. I couldn't anticipate the ways it would evolve into a story about secrets, my father's and mine, and that in the end, it wouldn't only be about secrets, it would be about love, too. Thank you.
So one of the things that I wondered as I reflected after I read the book was if you wanted to share an anecdote or story that for structural reasons or any other reasons didn't make it into the book.
That's a great question. Well, I worked on this manuscript for many years, 17 actually, to fully confess. And it had many iterations. And so I was always writing, much more, and then I was cutting everything back. But by the time I signed with the independent press that I signed with, I was working with an editor. And that was fabulous because he was fabulous and he really helped sort of streamline the story. But he made some suggestions of some things to take out. And, I understood his reasoning. One of the scenes he suggested to have removed was a scene in Greece. So Greece was my father's first field assignment. My father was 28, 29 when he arrived there. We arrived just before the Greek military pulled off this coup, conveniently enough. And that event in the Cold War at the time, it's hard to imagine now, but that event was a very hot topic of the day. I mean, that was seen as like a red line in the sand. Everything beyond Greece was the Soviet Union, was communism, was a threat. So we had just landed in this sort of pinnacle place that held back the Soviet threat. And that's how the US foreign policy viewed it. And so when I was a young person, when I sort of, Greece was my first home and I loved it, and it was a part of me. But when I learned later that the CIA had played this role, very likely in supporting this coup, which led to a dictatorship, I felt a lot of shame. So I grew, I lived my life with all this shame. And one of the things I did was travel to Greece and visit all of these important historic locations that were relevant to the coup and relevant to the dictatorship. And those were some of the things that were cut. Because they're very near and dear to me. There were times that I went to the place where the dictators, invaded the university and the university students were demonstrating against this brutal dictatorship, and the colonels sent their tanks in and just ran over 26 children, young people, and murdered them. And there's a commemoration there. There's a plaque there. It was really moving for me to go to this place because Greece isn't like an exotic, vacation for me. It really was my first home, and it was a part of me. So I had to let go of that. It was a moving scene to me, but I think maybe to an American audience, it was, it wasn't going to hold the attention in the same way. So that's one scene, and there are a couple more like that 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 I removed.
Any relevant to family? And...
I'm trying to think. I think in Greece I had.
I loved hearing about your nanny.
Yeah, my nanny Anna, and she was really important to me because she communicated Greek culture to me and taught me Greek, and I spent my days with her. This was like a privileged world. We lived in a neighborhood of embassies and mansions, and my mother was a painter, so she would go off and paint, and my dad would go, to the embassy and type things up. Meet with informants and try to infiltrate communist circles and trade unions and things like that. Of course, I didn't know that, so I spent my time with my nanny, and it was just a small, beautiful child's world, and she taught me nursery songs, and we went to the market. I had a lot of childhood scenes there in Greece that were just like these beautiful, like another beautiful childhood memory,
Yeah.
But at some point you have to sort of distill it and choose one or two that really just represent that, So she was an important person to me, an important part of the story. I don't think it would have been written if, I hadn't sort of felt the Greek soul from her. Yeah.
Yeah, have that attachment.
Yeah.
That emotional attachment to the place and through her.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, as indicated by the title and the whole story, there's sort of parallel coming out as a spy daughter, coming out as a queer person. And I wondered if anything in either of those journeys surprised you, or if there was anything about them that you didn't expect that happened.
That I didn't expect at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of with that, we never were, as you and I talked about the other day, we're terrible about understanding what the future holds. If you ask someone what they were like 10 years ago, they're like, oh, I was so different. I'm so evolved now. Well, what are you going to be like in 10 years? Well, just like this. Well, okay, that makes no sense.
Right, right. So
I'm just sort of, those are both such big processes, such big journeys.
Yeah.
And looking back, I'm wondering if there was anything that you were like, well, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah. I mean, I think lots of things I didn't see coming, when I came out to my dad. I mean, I grew up, I say a lot that I grew up in a house of secrets, which is the case. And I knew that my dad did something that was a secret. I did not know what the secret it was that I was carrying. So it's kind of a meta thing, right? I knew not to bring up what he did because of something, ... So it's kind of it was foggy. It's sort of like growing up in a house of fog, really. And so when I kind of realized I liked girls, let's say elementary school, middle school, I was already kind of living in this fog,
And a good secret keeper.
I was a good secret keeper. I was an automatic secret keeper. You don't have to tell a spy kid or an intel kid or to keep a secret. I mean, you have to really push to tell it, to learn to open. That's the real struggle, I think. So I just, kept it to myself, but I didn't really realize, I'm 12 and I think I'm a lesbian. While I was called a leslie by some neighborhood kids, and I knew that was a bad word, it was foggy. Who am I? I mean, my whole identity was kind of a fog. What we did as a family was a fog. What my father did, there was just kind of this amorphous mindset. So, fast forward, I'm in my 20s. I decide, I'm going to try and stop living a compartmentalized life. My father was compartmentalized for work. But it was a job for him, right? He signed up for his job. He got paid for it. There was a time that he lived his life before he was an employee of the CIA, right? But for CIA kids, we were just born into it. We didn't sign anything. There's no paycheck, right? So the thing is, it just comes naturally, right? You're just keeping a secret, holding secrets in general, learning to compartmentalize. It's just your family culture. And so, by the time I'm in my 20s, I was in therapy, thank goodness. And I was learning to try and put words to how I felt, break up some of that fog, name my feelings, and come out, right? So when I was in my 20s, I was in Boston, great town to be queer in. This was the 80s, right? Not the best time to be queer, but there was a movement, the gay liberation movement was happening, and I jumped right in and lived a very queer, open, let's go to Pride life, have girlfriends, but I didn't tell my dad a thing. And, at that point, my mother had died when I was in high school. So I just had this kind of distant, lame dad. And so I had this kind of double life, right? I'm super out, super queer, super, and then would talk to dad a couple of times a month, and not tell him anything. And at some point, therapy introduced the idea, of like, let's move toward wholeness, and okay, so I sent him a letter and I came out to him. And that was just like as much courage as I could really muster. And I think that I was surprised by his reaction. I thought that he would say, I'm done with you. I thought that he would walk away. He was a Republican, a conservative kind of person,
So that took a tremendous amount of courage. You're risking losing that whole relationship.
Yeah, and I thought, I was mad, and I was mad at what he did, and I was just going to do that. And he called as soon as he got it, and the conversation began where he said, I can't accept this. It's not normal. It's not natural. And I thought, here we go. Just what I thought. This is just who I thought you were. And he said, but we don't have to lose contact. And I was surprised, and it, was a little bit of we don't have to lose contact, And so we kind of went back to our corners and back to the compartmentalizing. We didn't talk about it. But he didn't want to walk away. He didn't want to lose our connection. And so, that was like a failure, a big F in parenting, to me at the time. But since then, I've come to see that as kind of a door that he left open, and a way that he was trying the way that he could, and quite a gift, really. So instead of the door closing and then no contact and whatever would have happened then, I don't even know. We would not even be in each other's lives, maybe, right? We stayed in each other's lives. And just that little door crack, I think, in a way, and there are other examples of it, allowed us to ultimately get to the place that we did, which is, an honest reconciliation that's not, decorated with, flowers and lights, but that's a real one, earned.
Imperfect, but authentic.
Imperfect and real and deep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things you've talked about in this conversation, and in the book, is about the community, the coming out in the community around being queer. What I don't know about is the community around being a spy daughter. And what's that been like for you? And when did you start to feel a sense of community rather than just, I'm the only person I know with this as part of their identity? Right.
Well, my sister is 2 years younger than me, and so she and I were always like spy sisters. Dad's weird, and he's certainly paranoid. Why is he always looking in the rearview mirror? We were on to him, So that was my first spy,
community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I went to, we went to a high school in Northern Virginia outside of DC. It was full of spy kids. Who knew at the time? Because again, the spy child does not talk about this.
This is news.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you later. I'll tell you later. But you know, children of
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's right there. And I didn't really know it at the time then either. So many other, intel, spy, CIA kids didn't know it. But but when I was, started to write about this journey of being the child of being a CIA daughter, I published an essay, and it was a big deal, and I was a little ahead of myself. I think that I almost was being more vulnerable than I could almost handle. But I published an essay, and it just told the story of how I found out my father was in the CIA, and went in the newspapers. And
you're what age?
And I was at this point, I was like, that's 2009, so I was in my early 40s. I'm 58.
Okay.
So I published that, and immediately I was contacted by tons of other CIA kids, or people who said, I think your story is my story. I have a dad just like you, just like yours. I think a lot of people hadn't been told, but they had put the clues together. And I started to realize there's a club of us out there, that the lucky ones know, that many people sort of struggle without that knowledge, suspect it, maybe find out very late in life what their parent did. Maybe it's the mother, maybe it's both, their father, both parents, and don't have the time. I felt bad to hear about other people who didn't have the time to talk to their parent, reconcile this. Who was their parent? To learn at the end that there is this false parent or this false person who never came clean, who never told you. That was bitter for a lot of people. I heard a lot of stories. And I just realized then that there's this, this kind of subculture of people who don't tell anybody, who feel like they have to protect their parent, even if they're retired, or, it's a family secret. There's so many secrets that families keep, right? There's, but it's a kind of a tricky one. So coming out of that closet, I get to meet a lot of other people who are also spy kids, and I've spoken. I've done some book events with other spy kids, and we're just kind of hungry for each other's company, because there's so many questions we have.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, your parents' relationship was a little rocky. It had some bumps. And I'm wondering, especially given how absentee he was, and then you had this wonderful uncle, and spent a lot of time in that household. And I'm wondering kind of, where did you develop your model for a loving relationship? How did you build for yourself an idea of what you want for yourself in terms of a loving relationship? You had multiple options.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's true that, the spy's life was hard on my mother. And when I was, I guess I was in early high school, my mother had what we used to call a nervous breakdown. It was an anxiety attack. It was an acute emotional anxiety attack, and she was hospitalized, and that was a major kind of traumatic event in my family. And I feel like that had a lot to do with this kind of world where we had to move all the time, and she could never say what her husband did, and she didn't have a community to plug into, and he was detached, right? He was not sharing himself, right? A partner who was withholding themselves for a reason. It's a kind of sacrifice. I can see it from many points of view, but it's difficult to nurture a relationship. And
he's gone for stretches.
And he's gone for, he went to Vietnam for 2 years. So he was just gone. Yeah. I mean, that was like, no parent. And that's when the breakdown occurred, right? He was gone. Outside of that, those 2 years, he was always like at the office, back and forth. But so I think that, my father's brother, who was 3 years younger, went in a very vastly different direction than my sort of conservative father, and my uncle was an English professor and a poet and a conscientious objector, which really roiled the family, and they had nothing to talk about at Thanksgiving at that point. But he, when my mother died, my sister and I went to my uncle's house in Vermont, and we spent time with them, and it was like, these are my people. Brown rice, and let's talk about Reagan and everything that's wrong with, foreign policy. And my uncle had a loving relationship with his wife. Mm-hmm. So, that started to open the world to me. Mm-hmm. And my parents loved each other, so I always knew that. But there was that struggle there. So, I think my uncle's marriage gave me an alternative.
Close to your aunt, yeah?
Yeah, my aunt they're both poets. My aunt was a poet, and she was working on a book telling her, breaking her silence. Mm-hmm. So I had these kind of brave, truth-telling relatives that were, opening a whole other world to me.
Yeah. So in the book you mentioned, you give at least two examples you tell two anecdotes about going back to Greece and what that felt like and what you did while you were there. But as you said, it took a long time to write the book. So I'm wondering, what does it feel like the last time you've been at Greece? What does it feel like to go back now? Because there's so many layers.
Yeah, I love Greece, and I think for years, I studied there in college. I would go back. I lost my mother, so I lost this home person. And so I sort of substituted Greece for my mother, and I would go there for vacations at work. I would, compile all my days and go to Greece. I went there for college. I would go there for, writers groups and things. I would just take trips there and try to seek that warmth I had as a child there. And but during those times when I'm just trying to get home, that home feeling again, I was also carrying my shame, right? Mm-hmm. Because in Greece, up until very recently, the CIA was a dirty word. And they were seen as like hand in glove. They set up the coup. They were in cahoots with the dictators. The dictators, tortured people, put people who just wanted their country back, detained them, interrogated them, a dirty word. We don't have that feeling here. You can be a lefty and very critical of the CIA, but it's our country. It's our country's, one of the governmental offices, right? Mm-hmm. But in Greece, no. In Greece it was, so I carried all this shame. So I would try to find this home warmth every time I went there. But I would also see all this graffiti on the walls, like CIA out, down with the US pigs, So it's really created a lot of conflict for me. And so I just kind of struggled and coexisted with that. And I think that's one of the reasons that I wrote this book, is I needed to resolve that. It's like in my heart, I love my father, I love Greece, but there's all this tangled up conflict, within my own heart. So I think Greece is one of the reasons I worked on this. Now when I go back, I feel pretty comfortable talking about it now. Mm-hmm. So now Greece is just one of my home places, and it's moved on, mm-hmm. It's has other traumas that it's working on. So, bankruptcy and all kinds of other challenges, right? So now I just think it's, if you grew up in a home that had some kind of dysfunction or some kind of feeling of being broken, and then you do some amount of reconciling or healing, you just carry your kind of mosaic of a home or mosaic of a family. That's what I do, mm-hmm. So it's this beautiful, imperfect, cracked home country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's lovely. So something that I know about from knowing you and also reading some of your essays is your attachment to open water swimming. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what that means to you.
Yeah.
generally, but also in the context of this book and
Yeah.
processing and these experiences you had.
Mm-hmm. It's great. It's a great connection to bring up.
First, I think maybe define open water.
Yeah, maybe like 8 years ago, a friend said, let's swim from Alcatraz.
And you didn't
let's
immediately
train and do that Alcatraz swim
No way.
that people do around here. And I said, okay. Okay, that seems something. That's something there. And I was always a pool swimmer, but not a team, swim team person. But we started to train to swim in the open water. We trained, with all these groups to get ready for the 1.24 mile swim from Alcatraz. Mm-hmm. And that really, we used a wetsuit, and it was a glorious swim, and it just ignited this feeling in me of riding the waves. And since then, I've, taken off the wetsuit, don't use the wetsuit.
What temperature is the water?
It's in the 50s. It's in the 50s. I may not be a warm-blooded person anymore.
Wow.
I don't know. I might be like reptilian now. But your body acclimates, and you just adjust to how long you can be in. So if it's 54 degrees, it's going to be a 20-minute swim, you know. But there's something about the way the waves saved me. And it's, you have to learn the tides, and you have to swim with the tides, and you have to stay safe. There's an edge there. There's a danger. All the swims we did are safe. We have kayaks, support. There's zodiacs out there. I never swim alone, never swim without support in that kind of, like the middle of the bay. But there's this feeling that I'm in something wild and I can't control it. And somehow I'm
There's sharks.
Just
saying.
Yeah, they're sharks. They're sharks. We like to say the sharks, the great whites, stay on the other side of the Golden Gate.
Because there's probably a sign they can read.
We just like to say that. There's a sign. It says no sharks beyond this point. You have the ocean, it says.
Yeah.
But, that ain't true. They'll come in, and but they don't like humans, I'm told. They don't taste good, and they go for the seals. And for the first 2 years I was an open water swimmer, I had constant shark thoughts. Constantly. Doesn't matter how far I was from, just like steps away from the beach, I'm like, shark, 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 shark. And then nothing happened to me. No shark bites. And 3 years go by. Yeah. So I don't even think about them anymore.
Wow.
Not at all.
Wow.
But, writing is writing about your life and writing about things that are scary. Is kind of like walking on coals, or is kind of like swimming swimming in cold water, swimming where marine life could be below you. There's something similar, and I just felt like it answered me and made me feel safe, and somehow the water always delivers me safely to the shore, and I followed this story, even though I was terrified by it, and I would learn something horrible that my father did, and I couldn't unlearn it, and I would know, what would happen to our relationship, but somehow I just felt like there's going to be a wholeness at the end of this, and I just tried to trust it, and similar to being in the waves, just like trusting the water, trusting the great ocean, that I'm safe.
And your own strength.
Yeah.
Trusting yourself.
Yeah, that's true. Right. Trusting myself and being with the force and the mystery of it. How it all works. I don't know.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I'll never get in that water. But that makes sense.
You don't have to.
I can hold a towel for you.
You can go on hikes. Yeah.
Those are my questions. That's what I got.
So those are brilliant questions. And
thanks.
Just wondered if you guys had any questions, anything you want to ask or share. There may be other Intel people in this room. I don't know. Yes.
So
full disclosure, Leslie and I are buds. We were buds
Uh-huh.
for 8 years, something like that. Susan and Leslie. And so we talked about, I didn't realize you were representing, but we talked about parents and fathers, and I have a jacked up childhood, jacked up father, no relationship. And so, but yours, kind of interesting. So my question is, given the spookiness of all of this, right, and what he was doing, and could you imagine a situation, a scenario where it could have been any different than it was? Could this have gone, like in my situation, I can imagine my dad having 85,000 choices he could have done differently. He had many other ways of being a father. Do you think he had other ways, and especially thinking about the community of people you've met, you know, how did those families traverse this? Or do you have any insight into that at all?
I do, and you know, when my father joined the CIA, he had some choices, and he wasn't recruited in college like many people are. Sort of, it's kind of a cliche, the professor that approaches the, you know, whatever college student. But so he was working in the city manager's office in San Antonio, which is where I grew up. So he's going to go into public, you know, public service or, you know, politics maybe. And the Cold War really was heating up and getting really intense, and he was afraid. You know, it was real. It's history for us, you know, but it was like lived fear, and he thought the days of the U.S. were numbered, right, being blown off the map. So he decided to go. He bought himself a ticket. He took himself to D.C. and he set up all these interviews. So he interviewed with AID. He interviewed with the FBI. He interviewed with the Peace Corps. Which is my answer to your question. Like, and when I learned that, and we talked, you know, in the course of me writing this book, we had some conversations about his life and his work, and he told me that, and I was just reeling. I was like, we're on the phone, I write Peace Corps, exclamation point. I could have had a dad who was like in, you know, Guatemala building wells for community. What's that?
He can talk to you.
Yeah. Right, he could talk to me, exactly, he could be open, we'd have things in common. He could do this, maybe he could do work in the world that I thought was, at the time, was, you know, was good work in the world. It wouldn't have been secretive, it wouldn't have been dangerous in the same way. You know, it just like kind of was a mind thing, it really flipped me. But he didn't end up doing that. He accepted he had an interview with an old OSS officer, the precursor to the CIA, an old, like a stern prep school dean who was in an army barrack and interviewed my father and asked him questions, and not at all like a CIA interview now, which is polygraph and a million, you know, forms. This was just like my dad, this man behind a desk, and in the corner, a very large, brightly colored bird, a toucan, a parrot. My father never remembered which kind. And the man would ask my dad questions. This was his CIA interview, people. Ask him questions, throw a seed from his hand to the bird in the corner. This was my father's CIA interview. It's a story he told many times, so I'm not making it up. And you know, he just asked, "What did you study in school? What was your major? Where'd you grow up?" All these kind of, toss. The bird caught everything. My dad would like to say all the grounders and the curveballs. I just imagine like a young man who's 28 and, you know, trying not to go like, "Oh my God, look at that bird," you know, just yes sir, like toss, yes sir, you know. And at the end of this interview, the man said, "I can't tell you where you live, where you work, who you'd associate with, what you would do, what your work would consist of. So why do you want to join?" And my father said, enigmatically, "I don't know. You haven't told me anything. I have no idea why." And the man said, "Good answer. You're hired." And I guess maybe I've never understood that story 100%. This is the way he told it. Maybe he was malleable. Maybe he was perceived as you are moldable. Maybe he was perceived in that moment as a good soldier. Mm-hmm. You're going to follow orders. You're going to be somebody we can trust. I don't have, but that was the story. And 2 weeks later, he got his acceptance letter, and he said he knew that the CIA was on the front lines of, keeping America safe in this international kind of, from communism. So maybe that's what motivated him most. But he interviewed with these other agencies, and he did have a childhood injury to his eye. So that's why he couldn't have a career in the military. He would have stayed in the military because he did 2 years in the Army, but he would never have been an officer. So.
But the Peace Corps doesn't have so much.
And I guess the Peace Corps just, he grew up in a house that was full of silence and sort of Midwestern people and didn't have a lot of words for ideas and he compartmentalized, I think, a lot as a child. So this was my uncle, the poet, says that his brother found a job that made official the way they functioned in their family. So, good question. Yes.
Did you just have the one sister?
I do, yes. Yeah, 2 years younger.
Does she share your views about this sort of dichotomy with your father?
Mm-hmm. She, when we were in high school, yes, she did. We were just sort of, put off by our fathers. He was a friendly guy. He told jokes. He watched TV. He wasn't like cut off, but he would act strangely and be paranoid, and he was always carrying a war around in his head, so he could be very stern, and you could just feel the anger. He wasn't violent or didn't go on big tirades, but you could feel the tension, right? So we were in the two peas in the pod, my sister and I. We agreed a lot, and then when we grew up, we felt similarly about, we had similar politics. When I started publishing, my father was older, and my sister, had kind of shifted and became more protective of him. And, she didn't want me to, there's one essay, she didn't want me to publish it. And it was difficult for me, and I understand that she was, I think she had felt hurt by him the way I had, but had come to some other place in which she, respected him and came to revere him, and in some ways was kind of idolized him. He became a different father that she needed him to be later in life. But I think she came to a place where she was supportive of me writing this, and but I think at the end it was complicated, and she wanted to hold on to a father that she needed, and shifted a bit. Yeah. Can I get you? I'm sorry, I got you. Yeah.
So I haven't read the book yet.
Okay.
I'm sorry, so
Yeah.
the book may answer this question.
Yeah.
I was wondering when you talk about learning to keep secrets, if that was explicit, implicit, maybe both, and do you have an example of how, as a kid?
Yeah. That's a great question. It was implicit, never explicitly said, about my father's secret, right? Neither parent said, don't talk about dad's work. Nothing like that. I just knew that we just never seemed to. And that seemed like that was a rule, But then when I was 10, and I write about this in the book, something, I don't know why, something must have, light bulb went off. And I wanted to ask my dad what he did for a job, because maybe he had never told me or something, And so I'm 10 and he's on his way to work. He's got his briefcase and I just stop him and I say, hey, what's your job? Hey, Dad, what's your job? And he stops and he says, I'm in the Army. And I think, okay, good. Immediately, great. That's, proud America, soldier, protection. But then I'd never seen him in a uniform, or he doesn't have one in his closet or anything. So, but I accepted it because I wanted that to be true, And then maybe just a few months later, I'm walking through the room. He's on the phone with somebody, and he says to that person, "Oh, I'm with the State Department." And nothing had changed in our lives. We're in the same house, same everything, And that's when his words became really slippery to me. And, not long after that, at some other point, he worked for the Pentagon, and it started to be like he's not trustworthy, and he's lying. He's lying to me. And I didn't have an explanation for it. Why? What is he, But that was kind of when I went on the down low, and now I'm going to try to figure out my father, because there is a secret here. When I was 13, I think the secret had been, my mother had had enough of the secret, and we were on a family drive, which we did, because that's what you do in the late 70s, early 80s. And so we were on a family drive, and my mother just turned to my dad. They must have had an argument or something in the house. And she turned to him and she said, tell the girls what you do. Right? She had brass ovaries. and we never talked about that. I was like, oh. And my dad got very uptight and, gripped the wheel. And, he said, well, I study events, and I manage people. He said, I manage people, And my mother said, and she turned to me and my sister in the back seat, and she said, girls, do you have any questions for your father about his work managing people? And I thought, okay, we're going to do this. So I started asking him questions. What do they do? People who manage, what do they do? They collect information. What kind of information? Information about events. What kind of events? World events. What kind of world events? International events. And there was Dad again, with his slippery words, right? And so I was giving up. And my mother could see that my sister and I were both giving up. And she turned to him and she said, you work for the CIA, don't you? And I thought, oh. James Bond, some popular culture at the time, flashed in my head. And he didn't deny or confirm. And so that was like something became explicit. There was all this implicit secret, then explicit liberating moment. But then, and I felt really liberated. I was like, wow, we're going to be a different kind of family. Maybe I'll talk about girls, liking girls someday. That could be cool. But then, the next day, week, month, family culture, everything went. We returned to our norm,
Well-established pattern.
Yeah, and we never talked about it again. We didn't, follow up, and so it became kind of like a gaslighting thing for me. Like, did that even happen? And I think I really kind of forgot about it for many years. And it was in a conversation with my sister when I was starting all of this. She reminded me of it, and I was like, right. That's how deep it all went, right? Yeah.
He's trained to resist interrogation, and your mom thinks you two in the back seat are going to get something out of it.
I know, and I was willing to give it a try, but I was never going to win. But that kept me on the case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did he ever show fear for the family because of what he did?
Show fear for the family, right? Like being afraid at home.
Did you tell anyone about the guy outside the gate?
I didn't. You know, when we lived in Greece, there was a moment when I was a child, so I was 5, and I wanted to leave our little gated compound, and I did. I was like, oh, I'm going to go see what's outside the gate, and I did that one afternoon, and there was a man outside the gate. This was in Athens in 1969, 70, and the dictatorship had been rolling along, and he said to me, Ella Vokoritzi, come here, girl. And this was like a very upscale neighborhood. People weren't hanging out and stuff. And here he was. And I remember he had like a 5 o'clock shadow, and I didn't know him. I had never seen him. Ella, he kept saying, come here, And I just got spooked by him, right? So I started to back up. And I backed back into the gate. And he then immediately started to curse me and walked away. And I tucked that into the back of my mind, and I didn't tell anyone. But in the course of working on the story, I wonder about him, and what was he doing there? I mean, just a few years later, the chief of the CIA station chief, Richard Welch, would be assassinated. So, a Greek terror cell came together in 1974, probably before that, and they waited for, just when the dictatorship ended, they started their killings, and they killed the CIA chief. And we had left by then. We had gone 2 years before. But so I think there was danger kind of all around, and I think my father carried a sense of it. He didn't share it and explain it, but I know that he sort of just lived it. And there was a point in which he decided he wanted to teach at university. He wanted to teach intelligence. He wanted to be a teacher. And to do this, he had to go through a very, a CIA sanctioned process in which the agency removes his covers. And it's a very particular process, and the CIA has to determine. They have to look at everyone you've ever worked with, every agent you've turned, every person you knew, and they have to determine is anything at risk, anyone at risk, any mission at risk, right? And if they determine no, then you can now come out, right? And you can acknowledge that you were an employee of the CIA, right? You can never just say whatever you want, of course, but, and he went through that process because he wanted to teach. And so he, got a gig teaching at the University of Texas at San Antonio shortly after he had his covers removed, right? And it turns out he was not well received because it was a very kind of left-leaning campus, and he got a lot of death threats and ugly notes in the mailbox. And I think he had his armor to protect him, but I think for my stepmother, scary. She carried his fear a lot. And so when I was starting to publish about my life, my stepmother was the person who carried the fear for my father, I think. And she said, I published that essay, and I told my father before I published it. He saw it, he made changes, it was a process, but when it was published, she called me and she said, "You've just signed our death certificate." And I think that was the fear. And that's where it was, she carried it. So, yeah.
Do you still have a relationship with her?
I do. Yeah, she thought the book was really moving and gives it to friends. And she's like,
people are so
bad guy in the
unpredictable.
book, kind of the bad guy, and that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing because the book to me is about a wholeness, and I started in a black and white thinking young person and came into understanding with compassion for myself and my father, and in that world and that time, and the to work for the government, and it all changed and changed me. Yeah. Yes.
Maybe one more question?
Okay, great. Yes, please.
The experience that you have surrounding reconciliation now, if you were to, I guess, time travel back to when you first started to make an effort to improve your relationship with your father, do you think you would go about it differently than you did then?
Answer that knowing this is my son.
Yeah. It's all good, Dwight. It's all good. Good news is coming. Good news is coming. I love that question. And for a young person to talk about going back in time, right? That's so cool. I think, it just popped into my mind. I would do things differently, and I would visit my father. I would have tried to visit him more, but more than that, I would have tried to work on or role play ways that I could speak differently with him. Because, he had his wall and I had my wall, and we got stuck in our corners, and we reconciled by the end of the book. And, and he apologized for, a transgression he had done as a parent, and my anger just faded. It was just gone. It's beautiful, He apologized, and it just, it transformed me. But we still didn't have that much experience talking to each other. We talk about the weather, or your cats, or how's your car running, stuff like that. So I think I would have wanted to get better, at trying to get past those obstacles and say, hey, Dad, can we talk about growing up? Can we talk about what your life was like growing up? What your childhood was like? I would have wanted to figure out ways to have a different vocabulary with my father. Yeah, thank you for that question. Thank you so much for this wonderful experience being here and coming in. Yay! Yeah. And I'm happy to answer more questions. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
I assume that they will have Leslie
Okay, good.
Yeah.
That's why you bad words.
Yeah, I know. I had to hold back.